What would you do if the only inheritance left to you was $5, a rusted iron door, and a warning to stay away? For June Calloway, 19 years old and freshly orphaned, that wasn't some idle question to turn over by the fire. It was a Tuesday morning at a county land auction, and it was the whole of her future. Everyone in Coldwater Flat agreed on one thing. The old Army supply bunker out past Miller's Ridge was worthless, sealed shut for nearly half a century, its door fused with rust. Its ground too rocky to farm, and too far from the rail line to matter to anyone with sense. But what June didn't know, what nobody left alive still knew, was that something had been waiting behind that door for 47 years. Waiting, specifically, for someone who could still read the language of iron. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Origin and mentorship before there was Coldwater Flat. Before there was an auction or a ledger or a locked door, there was a forge in Miller's Gap. And there was a man named Ezra Calloway who kept it burning. Ezra had built his shop with his own hands the year June was born, laying the hearth stone by stone, and for 19 years he never let the fire go fully cold, not through blizzard. Not through drought, not through the year the whole county seemed to hold its breath waiting for the railroad that never came. He was not a large man, but his forearms told a different story than the rest of him, corded and burn-scarred, and when he worked the bellows the whole shop seemed to breathe with him. He made hinges and horseshoes and plow blades for men who paid him in coin when they had it, and in eggs and firewood when they didn't. He never once turned away a job for lack of payment, and he never once explained why. June grew up on the floor of that shop, first playing in the cool sand of the quench pit, later sweeping slag and pumping bellows, and by the time she was 12, she was setting rivets straighter than boys twice her age. Her father did not treat this as remarkable. He treated it as simply true, the way water is wet and iron is heavy, and that quiet certainty did more for her than any praise could have. "Iron remembers," he told her once, turning a glowing bar under the hammer, watching the color shift from straw to purple to blue. Every strike, every quench, every year it sits in the weather, it's all still in there. You just have to learn how to read it back. He taught her the trade the way it had been taught to him, not through lecture, but through repetition, through the correction of a wrist angle. Through the particular silence that meant she'd finally gotten a weld right. She learned to judge heat by color rather than by clock. She learned the difference between a lock that had simply rusted shut and one that had been built, on purpose, never to open again. She learned to make her own tools when the ones she needed didn't exist yet, which was, her father said, the only difference between a smith and a person who merely swung a hammer. On her 16th birthday, he pressed something small and heavy into her palm. A peening hammer no longer than her forearm, its head no bigger than a walnut. Its handle worn smooth from use before he'd ever touched it. He'd forged the head himself years before, he told her, and stamped her initials into the pole the week she was born, certain even then that it would someday be hers. "A smith's hammer is the one thing that's truly hers," he said. "Everything else you make, you sell. This one you keep." She kept it in a leather pouch on her belt from that day forward, and she would keep it there through everything that came next, through loss. Through a cold ledger and a colder dismissal, through a journey into country that didn't want her, and into a darkness that had been waiting 47 years for someone with hands like hers. What she didn't know yet, what none of us ever know, standing in the good years, was how soon she'd need every lesson he'd given her. The loss and the cold relative Ezra Calloway died the way he'd lived, quietly, without complaint, in the cold hour before a February dawn. 3 weeks after a fever settled into his chest and refused to leave. June sat with him through the worst of it, feeding the stove, wringing cloths, listening to a cough that grew wetter and weaker by the day, and when it finally stopped. The silence in that small room was louder than anything she had ever heard. She was 19. There was no other family in Miller's Gap to take her in, no mother, long since buried. No siblings, only a half-uncle 2 counties over named Josiah Pruitt. Her father's older brother by a different mother, a man Ezra had spoken of perhaps 4 times in June's whole life, and never warmly. Word reached him by post. His reply came by wagon 3 weeks later in the form of the man himself, arriving not to grieve but to settle. Josiah Pruitt ran a dry goods concern in Haviston, and had the look of a man who had spent 30 years adding columns of numbers and finding most people wanting by comparison. He did not embrace June. He did not offer condolences beyond a single clipped sentence. He sat at her father's own workbench, moved the tongs and hardies aside to make room for a ledger book, and began to talk about the estate as though June were a line item within it. The shop and the small house behind it, he explained, would be sold to cover her father's outstanding debts, a mortgage on the property taken out 2 winters back, when the drought had emptied every purse in the county, including Ezra's. What remained after the sale and after Josiah's fee for administering the matter came to $14. $14, he said again, sliding the coins and a few worn bills across the bench toward her. And I'd call the account closed. You're a grown woman. You'll want to be finding your own situation. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Cruelty delivered as arithmetic doesn't require volume. June did not argue. She had learned from her father that some doors aren't worth knocking on twice, and Josiah Pruitt's was one of them. She counted the money once, folded it into her sleeve, and went a pack. She took almost nothing: a second dress, her father's old wool coat that swallowed her shoulders, a tin cup, a folding knife, a small Bible that had been her mother's. And at the very bottom of the bag, wrapped in a scrap of leather, she placed the peening hammer with her initials stamped into the pole. Josiah watched her from the doorway as she shouldered the bag. "Where will you go?" "Somewhere there's work for a smith," she said. It was the only answer she had, and it would have to be enough. The journey out, she heard about Coldwater Flat from a drover at the Haveston Depot, a leathery man who mentioned, almost in passing, that the county out west of the Notch was auctioning off a batch of unclaimed and tax-forfeited parcels. Cheap land nobody wanted, sold off in a single Tuesday sale to clear the county books. Cheap land was the only kind June could afford, and a Tuesday sale was as good a plan as any for a woman with $14 and a hammer. The stagecoach ride took the better part of 2 days, and with every mile the country changed under her, the way a bar of iron changes under repeated strikes, not all at once, but steadily, until it's something else entirely. The rolling green of Miller's Gap gave way to scrub and sage, then to red rock and long flat stretches where the only shade was the shadow the coach itself threw. By the second afternoon, the land had gone the color of a low-fire rust-red buttes, dust the color of old brick, distances so wide they made her chest feel hollow. "Not much out here," the driver said when she asked what waited at the end of the line. "County dumped that land at auction 'cause nobody in 3 counties would take it for free, let alone pay for it. Half of it's rock. Other half's got an old army bunker on it nobody's been able to get into since before the war." "Which war?" He shrugged, as if the question had never occurred to him. "Don't rightly know anymore. Old enough that it's just called the bunker." Coldwater Flat, when the coach finally rolled into it, was less a town than an agreement, a general store, a livery, a church with a leaning steeple. A scatter of houses along a single dusty street, and at its edge, a courthouse annex where the auction was already gathering a small, unimpressed crowd. The auctioneer, a sunburnt man named Otis Reed, ran through the parcels quickly, most going for a few dollars each to men who clearly intended to graze cattle on land too poor for anything else. When he reached the final lot, 40 acres of rock and scrub with, as he put it, one old Army magazine building, condition unknown, doors rusted shut. "Buyer takes it as is," the crowd actually laughed. $5, June said before she'd fully decided to say it. The laughter stopped, heads turned. $5, Otis Reed repeated slowly, looking her over, a slight young woman in a coat too big for her alone with a satchel over one shoulder. "You sure, miss? Ain't nothing out there but rock and a door that hasn't opened since Grant was president, near as anybody knows." "I'm sure," she said, and set the coin on the table. Nobody else bid. The gavel came down, and just like that, June Calloway owned 40 worthless acres and a door that the whole county had given up on. She had $9 left to her name, a hammer in her bag, and no earthly idea what was waiting for her out past Miller's Ridge. But for the first time since her father's funeral, she felt something that wasn't quite hope, but stood close enough beside it to be mistaken for kin. Settling in and first doubt the land, when she finally reached it on foot the next morning, was every bit as unkind as promised. 40 acres of broken rock and hard-packed clay, a single stunted cottonwood struggling near a dry wash and set into the base of a low rise. Half buried and half exposed like a tooth, working its way out of a jaw, the bunker. It was built of dressed stone and heavy timber, reinforced along its face with iron banding gone deep orange with rust. And its door, a slab of riveted iron nearly as thick as her forearm, sat in its frame like it had grown there. A rusted padlock the size of her fist hung from a hasp that hadn't moved in living memory. There was no house to speak of, only a linta shed with half its roof caved in, which she spent her first 3 days repairing with what timber she could scavenge and nails she straightened by hand over a fire ring, since she had no forge yet to speak of. She hauled water from a spring a half-mile off. She learned which rocks held the day's heat long enough to warm a bedroll through a cold desert night. Her hands, soft from months of grief and idleness in Josiah Pruitt's house, split and blistered and then slowly began to callous again, began, in other words, to remember what they were for. It was hard, joyless work, the kind that offers no proof it's building toward anything, and by the end of her first week, sitting alone in the linta with the wind finding every gap in the boards. June allowed herself, just once, to wonder if she'd made a fool's bargain. $5 had seemed like nothing to lose. Now, with $9 left and winter still months off, but already breathing down the back of her neck, it felt like everything. It was around that time she met Amos Ketch, an old trapper who kept a cabin 2 miles down the wash, and who arrived one evening with a brace of rabbits he said he had extra of, though June suspected otherwise. He was a spare, weathered man who spoke rarely and never wasted a word when he did. He looked a long while at the bunker door before he said anything at all. "Fella who built that place," he said finally, "worked it like he meant for it to keep a secret longer than he'd be alive to keep it himself." He chewed on that thought. Or maybe just on his pipe stem for a moment. Some doors don't wait for a key, girl. They wait for someone who still remembers how to knock. He didn't explain further, and when she asked what he meant, he only shrugged and said he'd heard old stories. The way everyone out here had heard old stories, and that none of them amounted to much you could hang a fact on. She turned the words over for days afterward, the way her father had taught her to turn a piece of iron under the hammer, looking for where it might bend. She didn't understand them yet. But she didn't forget them either, and in the weeks ahead, she would come to understand that some lines, like some doors, simply need time before they're ready to open. The first clue, it was the sound that started it, not anything she saw, but something her ears caught before her mind did. She'd taken to tapping along the bunker's stone foundation with the butt of her hammer each morning, partly out of habit, and partly out of the restless curiosity that had never left her. Even in grief, stone against stone rang one way, stone against packed earth rang another. But one morning, working her way along the base of the rise the bunker was set into, she struck a section of what looked like solid rock face, and it rang hollow. She stopped, struck it again. Hollow unmistakably, the sound traveling differently than it had anywhere else along the foundation. The particular resonant knock her father had once demonstrated on a hidden compartment he'd built into a strongbox for a rancher's wife. Back in Miller's Gap. "Iron remembers," he'd told her that day, "but so does stone when a man's cut it and set it back different than it grew." A worked seam disguised to look natural would never ring quite the same as the rock around it. A fact, he'd said, that most people never learned because most people never had reason to go around a house tapping on the walls. June had reason now. She spent the better part of an afternoon on her knees, brushing away decades of blown dust and scrub growth, and slowly a pattern emerged beneath her fingers. A line of mortar subtly different in color from the rest, a seam running vertical through what had looked, at a glance, like unbroken stone, and near its base, nearly swallowed by rust and lichen. The corner of a second, smaller iron door, no taller than her waist, fitted into the rock itself, entirely separate from the great door everyone in 3 counties had already given up on. Whoever built this place, she realized, hadn't just sealed one door and walked away. They'd built a second way in, one meant to be missed by anyone who didn't know exactly what they were tapping for. She sat back on her heels in the dust, heart going harder than the work alone accounted for, and looked at that hidden seam for a long, long moment. What would you do, finding a door nobody else in the world knew existed? June did what her father had raised her to do. She went and built the tools she'd need to open it. The physical discovery she had no forge yet, that would come later. But she had enough scavenged iron, a fire ring she could coax hot enough for rough work. And 19 years of watching her father solve problems with nothing but heat and patience. It took her 4 days. The small door's lock, once she'd cleared enough grime to study it, was a heavy warded mechanism. The kind her father had shown her dozens of times on old strongboxes and cellar doors, a design that worked by pattern rather than pins. Meant to stop a lockpick, but not a person who understood how the wards inside were shaped. The trouble wasn't the lock itself. The trouble was 47 years of rust, fusing every moving part into a single solid mass. She built her first proper tool that week. A slim iron pick, heated and hammered to a shape she guessed at from memory, quenched and reheated a dozen times until the temper held. When it snapped clean in half on her third attempt, she didn't waste time mourning it. She simply built another, thinner this time, and worked oil into the mechanism's edges for 2 full days before she tried again. The way her father had once worked a stuck plow bolt loose over a week, rather than force it and shear the threads. The hinges were their own battle. She packed the seams with oil-soaked rags, let them sit, packed them again, and finally built a small, controlled fire directly against the iron banding to expand the metal just enough. Just briefly enough to work a pry bar, forged, like everything else that week, by her own hand, into the gap at the hinge side. On the 5th morning, with her palms raw and blistered clean through their new calluses, she set the pry bar, braced her boot against the stone, and threw her whole weight into it. The hinge gave with a groan that seemed to come up out of the earth itself. She worked the rest of the door free in stages after that, a hand's width, then a forearm's, then enough to slip her lantern and her shoulders through, each inch fought for with the same stubborn, unglamorous persistence her father had put into every job he'd ever taken, paid or not. Dust and the smell of very old, very still air rolled out to meet her, a smell like a held breath finally released. She stood there a moment, hammer in one hand, lantern in the other, at the edge of a darkness that had been waiting patiently for 47 years. Then she stepped inside. The hidden room and the letter, the chamber beyond the small door, was no bigger than her father's old shop, perhaps 15 feet by 20. Carved partly from the rock and partly built up with the same dressed stone as the bunker's face, and everything in it had the strange, suspended stillness of a room that time had simply declined to enter. Her lantern light found a narrow cot along one wall, its wool blanket gone to dust at the edges but still holding its shape. A small writing desk, its surface bare except for a dry inkwell and a stub of pencil. Shelves lined with tin cans, tools, a coil of harness leather stiff as bark. On a shelf near the desk sat a row of ledger books, their leather covers curled but their pages intact in the dry desert air. And against the far wall, half covered by a canvas tarp gone brittle as old paper, sat 2 iron-strapped strongboxes. She opened the nearer one first, her hands steady only because she made them be. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay coin, gold and silver both, more than June had ever seen gathered in one place in her life. Stacked and counted with the careful precision of a man who'd handled army payroll before and knew exactly what he was protecting. The second box held papers, mostly requisition forms, a worn map, a small tintype photograph of a young woman holding an infant. Its edges softened from years of handling before it ever came to rest in the dark. And beside the tintype, wrapped separately in a scrap of oilcloth all its own, lay a small wooden bird no bigger than her thumb. Carved with a patience that spoke of long winter nights, and a hand that had nothing else left to give its love to. On the desk, weighted down by a rusted paperweight, she found the letter. The ink had faded to a pale brown, but the hand was clear and careful. The hand of a man who had written it knowing it might be the only conversation he'd ever have with whoever came after him. To whoever finds this, it began, "My name is Elias Thorne. I was quartermaster sergeant of this post, and by the time you read these words, I expect near 50 years will have passed, if this door has held as I built it to hold." The letter went on to explain, in plain and unhurried language, what had happened. The payroll gold in the boxes had been meant for men under his command. Soldiers posted to a rail line that never got finished, promised wages for work already done. His commanding officer, a colonel named Whitlock, had intended to funnel that payroll into his own accounts and blame the shortfall on Apache raiders. A story easy enough to sell in country, as wild as this one. Thorne had refused to be party to the theft. Rather than let the money vanish into a corrupt man's pocket, he'd hidden it here, in a chamber he built himself using skills learned from his own father. A locksmith back east, intending to reveal it once he could get word to honest authority. He never got the chance. A fever took him before the season turned, alone out here, with no one left who knew the chamber existed but himself. I do not write this seeking pity, the letter continued, though I will admit I have had cause for grief enough in my life. My wife and my daughter, taken by cholera on the crossing west. 3 years before I ever set foot in this territory. I built this room in truth, because a man needs something to build when he has nothing left to hold. If you have found this door, you did not find it by luck. You found it because you were patient enough and skilled enough and stubborn enough to look where others had already given up looking. That is not a small thing. That is, I think, the very thing this money should belong to. Use it well. See that any man still owed a fair wage in this territory finally gets one, if such a thing can still be traced. And make this place live again for someone who needs a home, as I once needed one and never quite found my way back to it. E. Thorne, Quartermaster Sergeant June, sat a long while in the lantern light, the letter in one hand and her father's hammer in the other, and let herself cry for a man she had never met. Over a grief 47 years old, and somehow still warm to the touch. What would you do, inheriting not just a fortune, but a dead man's unfinished promise? Let us know in the comments, because June was about to answer that question with her whole life. The choice and the community forms she could have left. $9 had become, by careful count over 3 lantern-lit nights, a sum large enough to buy passage to any city in the country and live comfortably for years without lifting a hammer again. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody but June herself would ever have known there was a choice to make at all. She stayed. Sergeant Thorne's letter had asked 2 things of her, and June set about both with the same patient thoroughness her father had brought to every job that ever passed through his shop. She wrote to the county courthouse, and to what military records offices she could locate by post, tracing what she could of the old rail line detachment and the wages Colonel Whitlock had never paid out. It was slow work, and not all of it would bear fruit, but enough of it did in time to see small sums finally reach 2 elderly veterans and 1 widow still living within reach of Coldwater Flat. Payments 47 years overdue and received, in every case, with a stunned and grateful silence June understood better than most. The second promise, make this place live again, she kept by building, plainly and without apology, the thing she'd always been raised to build. She used part of the gold to buy proper tools, a real anvil, a bellows built to last, and she raised a forge on the bunker land. Using the old army stone, as its foundation the way a person might build a new house on an old one's bones. The town noticed, the way small towns always do, not through gossip first but through action. Tobias Reed, the carpenter, showed up one morning without being asked and spent 2 days squaring the door frame on her new shop. Refusing payment beyond a meal, and a look at the strange old chamber everyone in Coldwater Flat was by then whispering about. Widow Sarah Vantry began sending her son up the wash on Sundays with a covered dish of stew and fresh bread, never staying to talk long. Never asking for anything in return beyond an empty pot the following week. And old Henry Duff, who'd run the only other forge for 30 miles and had long since let his own fire go cold with age, came by one afternoon, looked over her setup with a critical eye, and simply started teaching her the finer points of tool steel work in exchange for the chance to stand near a forge again and feel useful. None of them asked her to explain herself. None of them required tears or speeches. They saw a young woman working harder than anyone had a right to expect, and they responded the only way people in that country knew how, with their hands. By the 2nd month, June Calloway's forge was doing steady business, plow repairs, wagon fittings, tool work, and the worthless 40 acres past Miller's Ridge had become. against every prediction made at that Tuesday auction, a place people were glad to make the trip to. Word like that doesn't stay contained to one small town for long. And it was only a matter of time before it reached the two men who'd once been so certain June Calloway would amount to nothing at all. The reckoning the land-grabbing merchant of Coldwater Flat was a man named Cornelius Vane, who owned the general store, the only bank within 40 miles, and a controlling opinion on most matters of local importance. He had, in fact, tried to buy June's parcel from her the very week of the auction, offering $20, 4 times what she'd paid, with the easy confidence of a man used to being taken up on such offers. June had declined politely, and Vane had shrugged it off as a young woman's foolishness, certain the land would come to him eventually, one way or another. Once the winter or the loneliness or the sheer uselessness of the place wore her down. It never did. And by the time rumors of gold and old army records began circulating through Coldwater Flat, Vane found himself in the uncomfortable position of having publicly dismissed the very woman, now quietly becoming the most talked-about person in the county. He tried once to renew his offer, this time for $100, dressed up as neighborly concern for her welfare. June turned him down without raising her voice, and without needing to explain why, and Vane did not ask a second time. A man who has badly misjudged a person's worth rarely wants that misjudgment repeated back to him in public. Josiah Pruitt arrived 3 weeks later, unannounced, in a hired trap, wearing the same carefully unreadable expression he'd worn across her father's workbench a year before. He did not apologize. Men like Josiah Pruitt rarely do. Instead, he spoke once again in the language of ledgers, reminding June, gently and without malice he would ever admit to, that family ought to look after family, that he had after all seen to her father's affairs when no one else would, that perhaps some arrangement might now be made between them, given her changed circumstances. June let him finish. Then she told him, with the same flat calm he'd once used on her, that the accounts between them had already been settled, $14, and a closed account, his own words, spoken over her father's own bench. She saw no reason to reopen a matter he himself had declared finished. What undid Josiah Pruitt in the end wasn't June's refusal, though. It was a stray line in one of Ezra Calloway's old ledgers, uncovered by a Haviston clerk settling an unrelated dispute months later, showing tool inventory and shop receipts that never quite matched what Pruitt had reported at the estate's closing, a discrepancy small enough to have gone unnoticed by a grieving 19-year-old, and large enough, once noticed by someone else, to quietly end what remained of his standing in Haviston's business circles. He did not come to Coldwater Flat again. He simply, over the following months, faded, the way a man does when the town around him stops extending credit on his word alone. June never raised her voice at him. She never needed to. The truth, once it surfaced, did the work quietly and thoroughly, exactly as Sergeant Thorne's letter had promised it eventually would. Resolution montage a year is a short time and a long one, depending entirely on what fills it. By the following spring, the forge at the base of Miller's Ridge ran from sunup to well past dark most days. Its chimney smoke a fixture on the horizon, the way it had once been a fixture over her father's shop in Miller's Gap. June had taken on a young apprentice, a boy named Silas who'd shown up hungry and willing the previous autumn and never quite left, and Henry Duff still came by most mornings. Ostensibly to check her welds, mostly to drink coffee, she'd started brewing strong the way her father always had. The bunker's great outer door, the one the whole county had once declared impossible, had been reopened too in time, and repurposed as cold storage for the town's meat through the worst of winter. A use so plainly sensible that, within a season, nobody thought to mention it had ever been considered worthless at all. Widow Sarah Vantry's Sunday stew had become a standing arrangement, shared now at a long table June had built herself, where Tobias Reed and Henry Duff and half the town's working hands found their way most weekends, drawn less by the food, June suspected, than by the particular kind of peace that had settled over that once-forsaken piece of ground. Coldwater Flat had, without anyone quite declaring it so, become home. Closing reflection on the evening of the anniversary, 1 full year almost to the day. since a $5 bid had changed the entire shape of her life. June closed the forge early and climbed the low rise behind it to watch the light go copper, and then violet over the flat. The way it did most evenings out here, in its own unhurried time. She had two objects with her, as she often did on quiet evenings. In her right hand, her father's peening hammer, its head worn smoother now by a full year of her own use layered over decades of his. In her left, Sergeant Thorne's small carved wooden bird, its wings still crisp under her thumb despite everything the desert years had tried to do to it. Two men, she thought, who had never met and never could have, one who'd given her a trade and a way of seeing the world, one who'd given her, in the end, the means to build something lasting with it. One had raised her. One had, in his own strange and patient way, chosen her, sight unseen, decades before she was even born. She was 19 when she was handed $14 and told her account was closed. She was 19 when she paid $5 for a door nobody else believed was worth opening. And now, a year on, with a thriving forge behind her and a town around her that had become, in every way that mattered, her own, she understood finally what old Amos Ketch had meant that first cold evening on her land. Some doors don't wait for a key, they wait for someone who still remembers how to knock. She had remembered, and the knocking, it turned out, had been worth everything it cost her. Outrow, thank you for staying with us for this story of patience, inheritance, and the quiet worth so many people overlook. If you were moved by June's journey, please give this video a like, and share it with someone who's ever been told what they had wasn't worth anything. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale. Before you go, we'd love to know, what have you found value in that everyone else had already given up on? A place, an object, a chance nobody believed in but you. Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, be well, and remember, some of the most worthless-looking doors are only waiting for someone patient enough to knock.